Power changes what people eat, who eats when and how much, and that's exactly what I'll talk about today. Food in colonial India was more than just fuel, it marked identity, power, and class. So today we're going to sit at three very different tables: the farmer's hut, the bustling middle class home, and the elite banquet to see what each reveals about the empire that shaped them. Let's go. In the late 1700s, most Indians lived as subsistence farmers. The farmer's plate was simple but secure. Food was tied to the rhythm of soil and season. When the British took control of the revenue collection in the 19th century, they forced peasants in Bengal, Punjab, and the Madras Presidency to grow indigo, cotton, opium, and later jute instead of food crops. The pressure was so great that in 1859 the Indigo Revolt erupted. Thousands of Bengal peasants smashed indigo vats shouting, "Kneel, kneel," in defiance of a system that stole their grain. One of the starkest examples of this cash crop coercion was opium. The British forced the farmers in Bengal and Bihar to grow poppy, processed the opium under government monopoly, and shipped it east. Much of it smuggled into China despite the Qing bans. The scale and illegality of this trade helped spark the Opium Wars, a violent enforcement of imperial commerce. Those diverted acres and revenue logic behind them reduced food cultivation at home, a direct link between the forced opium farming and the famines that followed in India. By the late 1800s, famines became a regular and tragic feature of rural life. Colonial officers recorded villagers boiling grass or chewing mango seeds just to stay alive. The most infamous of these catastrophes, the 1943 Bengal famine, claimed between 800,000 and 3.8 million lives. It was not a natural disaster. It happened while rice continued to be exported to support the war efforts, leaving the local population to starve. A typical breakfast might be page, which was made by boiling leftover rice, millet, or barley in lots of water. A typical midday or evening meal for farmers consisted of rice or rotis, a watery dal stretched thin, a single seasonal vegetable if luck allowed, and a jar of pickle for preservation. Meat was a rare luxury seen on holidays or festivals. Snacks were practically non existent, but when hunger struck, a farmer might chew roasted gram, puffed rice, or sugarcane straight from the fields. For these people, food was fragile survival. One bad monsoon or a new tax could empty their plates overnight. Here's a fun story of how food played a role in revolution. In 1857, during the rebellion uprising, the British noticed something strange. Waves of chapatis circulating across regions, handed from household to household and forwarded onwards. Today, historians interpret the Chapati movement as a genuine but mysterious social signal rather than a centrally directed plot. Still fun to think about. As cities swelled with teachers, clerks, and small shopkeepers, breakfast looked pretty familiar to what we eat today. In the north, a stuffed paratha, paneer, or potato hit the tawa first. We had idlis and dosas in the south and poha in Bombay. Also in Bombay, Irani cafes opened by Zoroastrian Irani immigrants made a ritual of bun maska, a buttered split roll dunked in strong, sweet chai before the workday began. By the late 1800s, early 1900s, factory bakeries put loafed bread, butter, and biscuits on middle class tables. Think Britannia, founded in 1892 in Calcutta, and later homegrown brands like Parle. The factory was set up in 1929 in Bombay. Tea and coffee arrived in the 19th century, but it became habit and the national obsession by the 20th century because of the mass marketing done by the British. Tactics like traveling salesmen, factory office tea breaks, cheap cups at stalls, and how to brew ads in Indian languages led to the annual tea consumption being tripled over 25 years. The popular cup turned milky, sweet, and spiced. Planters preferred pure tea, but vendors and households had other ideas. Masala was a quiet rebellion, stretching flavor and countering the bitterness. In many towns, it came in kulhad, a unglazed clay cup you smashed after drinking, single use long before disposable or sustainable was a word. Much of the middle class carried their lunch from home, tiffin, and in Bombay, a very remarkable human network made it possible. Yes, you have heard of them, the Dabbawalas. They were already moving hot meals across the city by the 1890s. Dinner was usually lighter khichdi, rice with curd, or reheated leftovers from lunch. Not much excitement here, but that's okay because that leaves us more space for the fun part. Amongst the clanks of ladles and the smell of frying ghee, the streets became the noisiest dining room in the city. At chapati, a paper cone passed from hand to hand became a Bombay signature, bhel puri, mixed to order, a late 19th century mashup of chaat tricks the city claimed as its own. In Calcutta, students and clerks elbowed into lanes around Burra Bazaar and Sham Bazaar. Kachori, til bhaji, and addas spilled across the footpath and into cafes. Walking into the streets, you could hear the pop of Koli soda bottles, smell the earthy rim of a cooler before it shattered on the ground, and feel the warmth of leaf bolts on your palm. But the street foods, bhel, kachori, jalebi, samosas are still with us. It's the same recipes, but what has changed is the infrastructure of taste. In 1937, the brand Dalda launched an explicit, cheaper stand in for ghee called Vanaspati, which was basically palm oil. Vendors didn't switch for flavor, they did so for price and supply stability. So the menu stayed the same, but the memory of the bite changed. And the best proof of that are the amazing places that have survived the test of time and are still to this day serving us amazing street food. In Delhi, we have the old famous Jalebi Wala established in 1884, Kurimal Mohanlal Kulfi Wale from 1906. Parathe Wali Gali's earliest shop was set up in 1875. Kareem's 1913. In Bombay, we have Bade Mia from 1946, and yes, that's a picture of me at Bade Mia. And we have Bacha Cold Drink 1905 in Calcutta, Mitra Cafe 1910, Tunde Kababi in Lucknow 1905, Kevin Tours in Darjeeling 1911, and Bikaner Wala in Bikaner 1905. Basically, the flavors survived, but the cities around them evolved. At the very top of the social ladder, food became theatre. For Indian princes and zamindars, breakfast was served on silver plated plates, often featuring parathas drizzled with halwa or dosas accompanied by an array of fragrant chutneys. Lunch and dinner turned into lavish spectacles. Aromatic biryanis led with saffron, towering piles of pulao, rows of kebabs, and dozens of curries that ranged from mild to fiery. Desserts such as laddu, sandesh, and gulab jamuns arrived in gilded bowls. They didn't just taste rich, they actually were rich. Finished with whisper thin silver leaves called bark, beaten by Jaipur craftsmen. Hunting trophies, roasted venison, wild boar, quail, and even peacock were displayed as symbols of status. Yes, you heard it right. A bunch of rich people sitting around eating peacock. If you want a single image of elite excess, look at Hyderabad's Faluknama Palace, where the Nizam's dining hall stretches a gleaming 108-foot table with 101 rosewood chairs under a forest of chandeliers, banquets engineered as pure spectacle. A remarkable novelty of the era was the arrival of ice from Boston. In 1833, the New England Ice Company shipped the first cargo of clear ice to Calcutta. Elite households began serving sherbets chilled with this imported ice, a stark contrast to the peasants who could not even afford a pinch of salt. British officers in exclusive clubs in Bombay, Delhi, and Kolkata ate as if they were still in London. Breakfast consisted of eggs, bacon, toast, porridge. Lunch featured roasts, pies, puddings. High tea offered cucumber sandwiches, sponge cakes, and delicate biscuits. And dinner stretched into endless courses of roasted meat, custards, whiskey, and champagne. And these clubs were explicitly segregated. The dining rooms were not merely about nourishment, they were statements of separation, reinforcing the notion of British superiority. At some clubs, the message was explicit. Dogs and Indians not allowed is documented at the Pahar Tali European Club. And in Calcutta, the Bengal Club didn't allow Indian members until 1959. Some Indian elites began to adopt British customs. Tea became a fashionable ritual in princely courts long before it filtered down to the masses. Fine porcelain cups replaced the humble earthen kulhad and high tea rituals. Cucumber sandwiches and sponge cakes started appearing at elite Indian gatherings. Bakers in Calcutta and Bombay flourished, offering bread, butter, and pastries that signaled modernity and wealth. Conversely, the British fell in love with Indian flavors. By the late 1800s, there were British officers demanding the shipment of Indian spices, prompting companies such as Cross and Blackwell to mass produce curry powder. Chutneys, once a humble accompaniment, became a Victorian craze. Bottles of Major Grey's mango chutney found their way onto dining tables across London. And from this exchange emerged a distinctive Anglo Indian cuisine. There was Malagatoni soup, a British adaptation of the Tamil Milagutani, which is pepper water thickened with carrots, rice, and cream. There were railway cutlets, spiced meat patties designed for easy consumption on trains, popular from 1880s onwards. Then there's Ketgiri, a British breakfast of rice, smoked fish, and egg derived from Indian khichdi. These hybrid dishes illustrate how culinary ideas blended even though the diners remained segregated. Food crossed the tables, but the people did not. So I think food was a silent ledger of the empire, dictating who could afford a spoonful of sugar and who has to survive on water thin rice gruel. It fed power, it sparked rebellion, and it left a culinary legacy that still flavors the subcontinent today. If you found this glimpse into the plates of colonial India as fascinating as I do hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next episode where we explore fashion under the British Raj. Thanks for watching. See you soon.